Good day and welcome everyone. I'm Meenakshi Ganesh. I head the customer success function for CleverTap for the region APAC. CleverTap is the world's leading user retention, engagement and analytics platform for mobile businesses. Over 10,000 mobile brands around the world trust CleverTap to boost app engagement and unlock growth. In today's session, our panel of industry experts will be sharing their thoughts about the future of e-commerce in Southeast Asia. We will address the shifts in consumer behavior that have altered the face of retail as we know it, how e-commerce in Southeast Asia is different from the rest of the world, the region's mobile-first approach and the emergence of direct-to-consumer and P2P commerce, the importance of delivering a seamless customer experience across all channels, investing in technology that will evolve and scale with changing needs, and the importance of balancing marketing spends between acquisition and retention of customers with a focus on increasing ROIs and customer lifetime value. So let's kick off today's discussion with a question to all the panelists, which is, how is the Southeast Asia e-commerce landscape unique? And how does it stand out from the rest of the world? So let's start with Abdul Ghafoor, Chief Business Officer of Shipper Indonesia.
Hi, everyone. So for me, largely, there's a few differences that I see, the way e-commerce is done in Southeast Asia versus other parts of the world. And first is, you don't have a monopoly or duopoly that's established in Southeast Asia. So if you go to US, it's Amazon. You go to the Middle East, it's Noon.com or Souq.com, which has become Amazon. And you go to India, it's Flipkart and Amazon. So you don't have that kind of a consolidation that has happened. That's the biggest difference. And that means consumers continue to enjoy discounted, which is unsustainable kind of offers and deals and service levels potentially as well. The second thing is the campaigns that happen in Southeast Asia are much more rampant, right? All the way starting from 1-1, 2-2, 3-3, and goes all the way till 12-12. And that's not the case in other markets, right? And that kind of puts a lot of stress on online sellers, right? Because you kind of have, you have to have extra resources kept for a few days of every month, right? If it happened only once or twice in a year, it was slightly more easier to kind of manage that. The third thing is, I think, as somebody was saying, it's a mobile first market, right? I think a lot of other economies have gone through the desktop version and then transition into the mobile kind of concept. Apart from that, the last piece is, I think private labels are yet to kind of pick up in this part of the world, right? A lot of other regions have had greater adoption to private labels or private brands, which isn't the case in this part of the world. But that's the kind of differences that I see as in today.
Right. Thank you so much, Abdul. All very valid points and definitely things that make the Southeast Asia e-commerce landscape unique, like you pointed out. Next, I'd like to ask the same question to Mayank Singh, Head of Marketing and Technology at Domino's Pizza Indonesia.
Thanks, Meenakshi. First of all, hello and namaste to all the listeners and to co-panelists. So I'm Mayank, take care of marketing and technology for Domino's Pizza Indonesia. And it's coming back to your question, I mean, the Southeast Asia is a unique proposition in most of some of them were highlighted by Abdul. I would add few more points to it. Other than being the mobile first, we need to also understand why it's mobile first. Reason being, if you see other part of the world, the internet started from desktop to laptop and then promoted to mobile. Whereas if you see this Southeast Asia, specifically to this country which I am currently sitting in, Indonesia, the people for the first time they explored the internet on the phone, and that's why the mobile adoption becomes very big in this part of the world. Even when I see on my own data, I see maximum number of conversion and the contribution happening through mobile compared to a desktop, because not many people have the desktop. And mostly those commerce is happening on the mobile. The other is the way the e-commerce is used in this part of the country. India being my home country, I see people use Uber for taxi. They would use Zomato for food ordering, and then they would do shopping on Flipkart. Within Flipkart, on Amazon, they would go and buy for the electronics. On Flipkart Myntra, they will go for apparels. But if you see the Southeast Asia, it has come up with a new concept of the super apps, which is one app for everything, which is kind of being adopted by humongously, and the fight in this kind of market is consolidating between the super apps. The recent news of Goto being formed, where Gojek and the Tokopedia collaboration happened to compete with Shopee, is one of that example. So in that way, it's very unique. There's a lot of what is happening, and the most important point about this market is, in the world, this comes from a data which shows that the adoption rate of the commerce in this part of the world is highest among the world. That makes this market as very unique.
Super, thanks for sharing your perspective, Mayank. Let's hear from Keith To, CEO and co-founder of Daily Vanity Singapore. Keith?
So I think to build on Abdul's sharing about there's no monopoly or duopoly over in Southeast Asia, it's because it can be mainly due to the fragmented nature of Southeast Asia. We have different languages, we have different culture, even though we are a big family of Southeast Asia countries together. I think this made it difficult to have really one or two standout players in the market. So of course, this being a challenge for a lot of players, it's also an opportunity for someone who is able to consolidate this fragmented market. Next, I think actually our speakers earlier on, Mayan and Abdul, has shared quite a lot of unique proposition of Southeast Asia as compared to the region. So I thought I would also add about the payment modes are different also, because like say in Singapore, most of us have credit cards, so most of us will be transacting through credit cards or debit cards. I understand throughout the Southeast Asia region, a lot of people are actually using like cash on delivery or through e-wallets, which is something that's very different from Singapore's behavior, because I think when we have e-wallets, the usage may not be as high as payment by a credit card. Yeah. So this also makes the whole ecosystem very challenging for one single player to consider so many different kind of approach based on the consumer's behavior. Yeah, so that's what I feel about. And of course, because mobile first is there, very predominant in many parts of Southeast Asia now, like Mayan and Abdul has mentioned earlier on. So that's my take about the difference of us.
Yeah, thanks, Keith. I think you made a very valuable point about Southeast Asia being not one country or one culture at all, right? It's a combination of so many different countries, and with each country having a very unique customer and consumer set and behavior. And you've touched upon a very important point around payment modes as well, which is extremely disparate across every single country that we come across. So thank you so much, Keith, for sharing that. Next, I'd like to call upon Claudius, President of the Singapore Chamber of E-Commerce, to share his thoughts on this.
All right. I think the previous speakers, the panelists, they spoke a lot on the points, which is good because I don't have to talk about all those. But I feel that Southeast Asia is, to me, is like an area of incubator in the whole world, because we are between the East and the West. And we do have the blessing from China, which is the manufacturers of the world. And they also have a lot of strength even in terms of e-commerce, and the blessing of the West, which is the bigger markets. And we are in the middle. And when we're in the middle, our market is not so small as well. And Southeast Asia, because Indonesia, because there are a lot of countries in Southeast Asia that are still growing, still developing, and population will still grow. That's one. So there is an existing market that is good for businesses to do a startup. All right. Second part is that there's sufficient diversity, because there are many races, many religion, many political climates even. And beyond those, there are a lot of things in which it's not too difficult to find a first target audience to have a point to which you can do a startup. But the third aspect is, I feel also is important, because there could be also personas that are cutting across different countries because of the same race, because the same level of same religion, same maturity level. So so I feel that Southeast Asia is really a very good incubator for companies. So all I need is really to have countries that promote innovation, that can fund such growth, that can also allow us to do more integration in terms of the, just now we say mobile first, but I feel that is financial integration is coming in the next 1 or 2 years because of Grab. So it's coming very soon. So with that, it's actually very, very right for startups to be in Southeast Asia, preferably in Singapore, but I think Malaysia is also coming up quite well. Even for companies that even from the East and the West or maybe from Europe can come over here to do a startup in e-commerce. So I find that we have a very interesting environment on that, and I think we're ready. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Claudius. I think that was a very unique viewpoint as well. The proximity to China, I think, is something that people don't really factor in when they're looking at how e-commerce has developed in Southeast Asia. So thank you for bringing that up, Claudius. That's a very valuable point. Rounding off the panel for today, let's hear from Shrikant, Head of Digital Matahari, Indonesia.
Hey, morning guys. Thanks for having me here. Yeah, so I think every one of them have spoken so well and pretty much talked about all the points. So what I think is there's a huge appetite, I would say, and it's kind of similar to what Abdul referred to with regards to monopolies or duopolies in some of the other economies he talked about, unlike markets out here, because so I come from an environment which is a traditional retailer, who has always been a traditional retailer and now emerging to be the next big omni-channel retailer. So which goes to show that there's so much of an appetite and further room for you to develop your own direct to customer, and that's what opens up. Unlike in other markets where it becomes really difficult for you not to be dependent on the big marketplaces who are capturing majority of the market share, which is not the case here. You still have more room because of how fragmented geographically the locations can be. If we just talk about the likes of Indonesia, Philippines, or even Vietnam for that matter, so it becomes a little more diverse, and that's where the concerns like logistics or payments and all those come into picture. And this is where the play of omni-channel really comes into play, which has been a buzzword ever since, and not every retailer has been able to adapt that. But I think it's a really amazing opportunity one can have in this region because of the way it is diversified, because not everything is saturated. There's still room to expand, and that's something which can be built on. So again, it's very early days in this market. So definitely there's a lot more room for innovations which one can do.
All right, thank you so much, Shrikant. So the COVID-19 crisis has obviously led to dramatic shifts in consumer behavior, right? So traditional brick and mortar retailers have had to very, very rapidly evolve their e-commerce strategies in the new COVID trading environments. So Shrikant, how has Matahari pivoted from offline to online, and what have you seen working for traditional businesses that want to go online?
Yeah, I think we were fortunate. We were fortunate that Matahari understood the importance of their digital channels and the entire landscape. And we started building on our digital capabilities way before COVID started. So we've been running our e-commerce, our digital operations, and the whole transformation which we were doing within the business for the last few years. So that really helped us because we were not caught unguarded in a way, because we knew what was coming. So that's how we were able to pivot in a much effective way. And when the months of March and April and May, all those months, especially last year when all the stores were shut because of the regulations, we still had our e-commerce capabilities as well as some of the other social commerce bit, which I can talk about a little later, opened up, which further allowed us to not only drive our top line revenue, but more importantly, stay relevant with our customers and try to provide a better experience to them. So we had that advantage. But then, because I have a lot of my industry peers, and they were in a different boat where they had to literally come up with rocket speed to launch something because they never had these digital shop fronts to manage the crisis. And they were also able to do that, and that's how people started looking out for various innovations, various easy way outs, just to build on something which will allow them to stay relevant, to perform, to manage business, but that's a big lesson, which people have got, and how digital, which used to be one of the slides in a board meeting, has become the talk of the town, and that becomes your most important subject. And which will continue to be so, because even now with the relaxations, some sort of relaxations, we're still seeing how digital continues to grow alongside your retail or brick and mortar. So I think it's a big call out to all such platforms and partnerships which happened and which was all relevant. But I think we were fortunate enough to lay the foundations of our digital business way before.
All right, thank you so much, Srikanth. Claudius, how are you seeing Singaporean businesses becoming e-commerce ready?
Oh, big question. During the COVID, I think the question has to be spoken in context to these 2 years. So during the COVID time, Singaporean business see a big drop. But in terms of those with very mature channels for sales, for e-commerce, see a big rise, especially in the few areas. We talk about electronics, we talk about even fashion. It's like people get locked up, nowhere to go, but you still buy fashion, right? But we have then people who are getting hobbies, equipment, especially physical, those with gym equipment. And then we also, last one, which I think is probably the only one that is able to sustain, are the groceries. So in fact, I think in overall e-commerce revenue went up about 2.8 times during the COVID time. So, and that's basically fueled by, I think in Singapore culture, it's more that when there's a news on COVID, so people queue up at the supermarket, to get stuff, right? And basically, I think that's not wrong, right? But you have to basically find that if one person is queuing up at supermarket, there's probably now 0.8 that's online by, right? So the other part is that I feel that the channels for buying and selling always go back to the lowest denomination. So it's like which is the app that you're most familiar with right now? Could be WhatsApp, could be Facebook, it could be a marketplace. Most likely it's a marketplace that you get from. But there's a shifting towards the mixture of the apps that you are familiar with. Number one is that I think it's shifting away from even in terms of social media, it's shifting away from Facebook type to a more WeChat aspect, to a more TikTok, So, and I think the buying and selling channel right now is very ripe to be able to sell on those channels as well, and to be able to transact on those channels. So as long as the financial aspect has been sorted out, that you can actually get a store there, there's a shopping cart, you can actually buy from it. The first 2 times you get it, the rest of the time you basically be shifting over there. All right, so I think that's why marketplaces is right now creating a lot of live streaming, because I think live streaming used to be quite strong for social apps as well only, but now I think it's very much everyday thing. You can have access to like 3,000 channels now in Taobao. You can actually have a look there. So basically, I find that the buying and selling aspect has to be tied to social. That's one. Number 2, the experience has to be very close, as in the person is speaking to you. So live streaming is number 2. Number 3 is that social is also very much with the community that you deal with. So I find that there is an influx, there's an increase in social e-commerce, as in a more direct selling way. All right, so there could be a person who's like a sales team leader, and he sells to the community that's around him. All right, it could be geographically grouped together, or it could be in terms of the industry. So that can be kind of the trend to which the buying and selling can take place, because of the social aspect of it. So social aspect really bump up a lot during the COVID, because what else can you do? You have to use this to get online to speak to your friend. So I think this is going to be the behavioral change now. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much, Claudius. I think you brought in a lot of very valuable points, which were very unique to Singapore and the way that we, the consumers here in Singapore operate, but also how this can actually be extended, where Singaporean businesses can take the same model to pretty much anywhere in the world, and especially to the rest of Southeast Asia. So thank you, Claudius. So now that we are on channels of commerce, marketplaces are evolving very rapidly through, a continuous innovation in AI, in automation, phone technology by itself, and also consumer awareness. And that's getting people more and more comfortable in purchasing expensive as well as complex products and services online, right? So with this in view, Keith, what do you think is next for marketplaces?
I think as the marketplace becomes more mature, right, you see a lot more sellers coming onto marketplaces like Shopee and Lazada. So there will be more competition among sellers, and sometimes products are commodities. Earlier on we talked about private labels and OEMs, or those white labels companies coming in, right? You make the space even more difficult to be different, to be differentiated. People will be looking at maybe a massage gun, like, okay, why is this $200 and why is that $20? They seem to be the same. Should I get a $20 one? So there will be a lot of competition for many brand owners. I think that's one thing we need to understand as marketplaces go on. And because of this issue, and many brand owners and marketers having the desire to obtain more data of their consumers, this issue will also make people wonder, can I get more from the marketplaces? Can the marketplaces share more data with me so that I can tweak my offerings better and be differentiated? Because I think, as rightfully pointed out earlier on by one of the speakers, that our space here is very subsidized. Yeah, we're getting very cheap stuff because the marketplaces are all trying to gain a foothold in the industry. So they need to offer very, very low price items. So this in terms affects the profitability. And eventually the marketplaces will increase their commission. I think currently now we are at less than 2% or 5% commission, or maybe even 0% commission for some marketplaces. So that's why there are a lot of sellers coming in. But eventually, some niche marketplaces that I'm seeing are actually charging like upwards of 50% commission. So maybe we'll slowly move towards that stage. This will make all the brand owners and the manufacturers be a bit more scared to release their products on marketplaces, because the margin is going to be so small later on. So from there on, from how it's going to be evolving, right? I see that manufacturers and maybe brand owners will want to go direct to the consumers already, and maybe bypass marketplaces, set up their own Shopify shops in shop front. So this will give them better margins and also better control of the branding, because sometimes, I mean, at the end of the day, branding is all about trying to stand out and look different. But then sometimes when you're on marketplaces, it's hard to stand out and look different from the rest of the competition. Yeah, and I think that as there are more plug-and-play solutions available in the market now compared to like 5-10 years ago, it's easier to set things up rather than customize the whole system and building it up from scratch. This is a skill set by itself, because you need someone who is familiar with what can be done. But then once you have all those plug-and-play solutions, you can, I know I can just install this solution to get this, and it's all done within like less than 10 minutes, maybe onboarding 1 week. Versus like you need to take months and maybe even years to set up a proper system that is according to your needs. Yeah. So from there, I see a lot of sellers wanting to have more control. And I think that marketplaces will need to think of how they can balance this control and being unified look for the users. I think besides this, Claudius also mentioned about live streaming, and I think that marketplaces like Shopee and Lazada are pushing very hard for live streaming. So probably some of us here may not be personally attracted to live streaming. Like for myself, I don't really buy things online via live streaming. I do watch a bit, but I don't get attracted by it. But having said that, sometimes we base too much on our own experience, and then we say, nah, live streaming is not going to work. But if you look at the numbers, from what I recall, last year when we were all in the COVID situation, whereby Lazada and Shopee were pushing out a lot of live streaming, we see an average about 4,000 viewers per video. And now if you look into their apps again, you're going to see like 20,000, 40,000 viewers on all those videos. It has really increased a lot in the past 1 year. So a lot more people are going on to, a lot of people are going to watch live stream and buy on live stream. So it's something that I think a lot of marketers should not avoid, because for fear of the unknown, or perhaps because of their own preference of not believing in shopping on live streams. So that's how I think it kind of move towards too.
Thanks, Keith. You made actually a lot of actually very, very valuable points. But one that I want to pick out from that is the fact that on marketplaces now it's becoming more and more difficult to stand out and to differentiate yourselves from the other brands there. And that obviously dilutes the brand experience for the end consumer as well, right? So for any brands that have considered establishing a direct-to-consumer channel in the past and decided against it, now is the time to reconsider. And the growth of the DTC industry isn't set to slow down anytime soon. So Abdul, as an investor in DTC businesses yourself, right, how do you see this model evolving and growing?
So the way I look at it is largely, first, it technically isn't a distribution or a demand channel. It's about building a new brand, right? I mean, it just happens to be that that brand only has one channel, or largely is focused on one channel. Second is, so I keep saying this, right? Indonesia, Southeast Asia, barring Singapore, is 5 years behind of India and 10 years behind of China, right? So seeing what's happening in those markets, right? I think first, direct to consumer brands are never for the mass market. It's always created for the top 5, 10%, because the cost of marketing, the cost of premiumness, all of that can only be afforded by that, right? You can't create a mass market product. Second is, as I said, it works for products which have high repeat purchase, high brand loyalty, right? Cosmetics, skincare, things like that, or for anything that has high value. Now, the other thing is, from a consumer perspective, it's not about the channel, but it is a brand that they can brag about, right? And when they can brag about, price is no more a logic, right? It's just like as good as using an iPhone, right? You would end up paying whatever you have to pay for it, because you can show off, right? So it has to be that kind of a product. And I think in the last year and a half or two, you've seen a lot of D2C brands cropping up, and D2C brands that existed, kind of increasing their sales for a couple of reasons, right? One is people are more aware of health, nutrition, pollution, all of those, right? Kind of the causes, the good causes, right? Second is they also have enough time to kind of explore and be aware of options available in the market, right? Which kind of relate to a cause they kind of strongly believe in. A third is also the fact that, considering that you're not spending too much money outside, and since you're part of the top 5, 10%, this is kind of their go-to meditation, right? Kind of spending, splurging, so all of those put together, I think D2C businesses in this region will accelerate, obviously picking up cues from other markets. And I strongly believe that they would be somewhere in the range of 5 to 10% of overall e-commerce business in the next 5 to 7 years in this part of the world.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Abdul. I think that probably holds true for a lot of the retailers in spaces like apparel or cosmetics or even luxury goods for that matter, right? But I want to shift the focus to something which is very different, but also extremely where probably I would say it's almost a necessity in a way. At least for me, pizza always is. So Mayank, what's next in e-commerce for businesses like Domino's, right, who have a very, very robust and mature DTC model already, right? For you, for example, it's not probably only for the top 5 to 10% of your customers at all, simply because of what you sell. So what is your take on this?
In direct to consumer, the most important aspect is how are you going to improve the whole customer experience, and that is where you are able to build the loyalty to the customer towards your platform and towards your brand. And that has been the focus area for Domino's globally. And that's why you would have heard of they doing many of the innovative stuff, from drone delivery to a delivery which is happening through driverless car and whatnot. We as an Indonesian market has not reached, so I have a lot of to catch up, especially what has been happening. But there are a lot of things which has happened, which is a very good case in terms of improving the customer experience. For example, the Japan was doing a customer experience enhancement by delivering a pizza in less than 10 minutes, and that was happening by using the role of data and the AI, by predicting basis the behavior on the app of the consumer, that whether he is going to place the order or not. And once those signals are sent to the store has to take a decision basis the red, green, and the yellow light, that whether they should start preparing this or whether they should not. And hence, when a pizza is delivered within 10 minutes to you, less than 5 minutes supposedly, I mean, you would be shocked to know that how did that happen. And that's a customer experience. So the whole idea is to improve the customer experience for a brand who's already established. And that's the goal of every player out there in the market who's into D2C, to keep improving this. The second part to it is finding the new avenues. I mean, this whole commerce thing that we are today talking about, it's just a channel. It was always a channel, and these channels were there from the ages. The market first used to be a normal marketplace, which became to a malls, and then you would have heard of this internet. People shifted there. The TV was there, so the tele shopping started to happen. The phone was there, so tele shopping started happening there. And then mobile came, and it has evolved to mobile. So as a brand, you would have to see this as a channel. Within the e-commerce, there has been multiple channels that has been coming up. So the website was, the web commerce was one. The mobile commerce is second. I mean, today we are already talking about this conversational commerce and the social commerce as an aspect. The WhatsApp is there. The people are sitting there, and that's where you are eyeing towards growing into the area where the people already are sitting, and how can you leverage that engagement into commerce for your own brand. Having said that, I mean, we are also going to launch very soon, in coming few days, the chatting bot with the WhatsApp. In the QSR also, Domino's Indonesia was the first one to do a chatbot ordering through our own chatbot. So if you go to our app, we have a chat. You have the app, but you have the chatbot experience as well. You can speak to the bot and place your order. The only difference is that the consumer experience still needs to be improvised. The first set we did was we just copied the behavior of an mobile experience into the chatbot experience, but that's not the way it will work. The chatbot experience will have its own way of doing a commerce, and we will have to do more research and adopt that to give it back to the consumer, so that at the end of the day, the experience is better and more the sale is for us.
Awesome, Mayank. And I've always been a very big fan of all the innovation that Domino's has brought in, for sure. So in recent years, and you bring us to a very good point in our discussion as well, right? In recent years, Southeast Asia has emerged as a leader in mobile e-commerce, right? With very high awareness and adoption of mobile channels, not just to buy, but also to sell. And Southeast Asian online shoppers are also much more likely and open to experiment and bypass all these traditional e-commerce channels as well, in favor of newer channels, such as, like you brought up rightly, right, conversational as well as social commerce, right? So Shrikant, where do you see the trend of social and conversational commerce heading?
Right. Now, again, so very relevant question, and it's something which, as I speak, so many of the companies I'm aware of have either been using them or already planning to use and invest in them. So, I think what became very important as a realization has been the fact that how do you want to diversify your distribution channels? So that came up as a question to reach out to more customers and drive your revenues. And definitely, social media in this part of the world is highly prevalent, not just from a marketing or a customer communication standpoint, but also how do you make it transactional? So this is something where personally for us, we were struggling to find the right solution, but and COVID really helped us here, because what really happened was, as I was saying earlier, like last year when COVID hit us and when we had to shut down everything. And this is where, of course, we had our own direct-to-commerce e-commerce websites, which came into play, which were already there, but that really got adopted a lot more. But along with that, we started looking at some of these conversational commerce, some of the messaging platforms. So we started with WhatsApp, where we devised this new process called Shop and Talk. So which was completely decentralized as a process at a store level, and we have close to 150 odd stores across the country. So with that, what enabled us was we were able to empower and completely decentralize to at a store level, where the stores were directly engaging with the customers based on the geofencing, and they could reach out to those customers by sharing digital catalogs. This is for the brands, for the assortment, for the stocks which is already lying in their local stores, and then allowing to make payments through e-wallets and the traditional bank transfers, which is very popular here, as well as integrating with the likes of the Grabs and the Gojeks to make the on-demand deliveries happen. So that became very beautiful for us, because it didn't take a lot of time to set up. It didn't involve too much of an investment from a dollar perspective. And more importantly, it helped us to empower the teams, and the teams started working and getting out of their own distress and anxiety issues, because when the stores are closed, we have more than 10,000 staff in our retail force, and they were all sitting idle. So this also gave them a purpose to then continue to work hard, and also service our customers. So this was just one of the examples. And of course, back then this became a very important channel. But even now, when our stores are all working and we're pretty much all open except for one or two locations, Shop and Talk as a service continues to grow alongside the other direct to customer channels we've got. So I think it just goes to show that uh, uh, that there was always an appetite, but definitely the pandemic further fueled the growth, which we have personally seen. So I think, and we are now looking at various other channels as well, which could really help in driving a much better experience. We already have a chatbot which is native to our apps, where there is a level of AI, but definitely that needs a little more maturity to take on to that next level. We will be investing in further other systems which could come with all these softwares which are available, which aggregates these messaging platforms for the customer. So it provides a much better response to the customer without too much of an involvement of a human interaction. So we are now looking at various such options, because there is a clear demand. There is a clear ROI, because it's a tried and tested tool for us. So I think this definitely is something which is gonna go a long way. And I don't even want to start on the whole influencer and KOL side of things, where how this kind of complements so seamlessly. So definitely, I think this as a new channel is very much complementary to the existing channels for any retailer or for any brand for that matter, and it has a long way to go.
All right, thank you so much, Shrikant. And I know we are running a little short of time, but I do want to touch upon a very, very important aspect of this, right? Which is the customer engagement and retention side, because customer retention has become even more of an uphill battle now for retailers, right? The competition in the online space is extremely stiff, and consumers are obviously spoiled for choice. So businesses must balance their marketing spends between acquiring new customers and retaining and growing their existing customers, right? So just maybe one line each from Mayank and Keith. So Mayank, as a marketing leader, right? What is your approach to designing a marketing strategy for e-commerce in the current landscape?
You rightly said, Meenakshi, the retention is the key for any business. And before even coming to retention, the important aspect is the data. How are you collecting your data to be utilized into a meaningful action is the key. So as a marketer, the first we need to ensure that is our data collection policy and the kind of data that we are capturing, which can be reutilized in certain form is happening or not. Once that is there, then you would have to start devising the programs against the around your own system. Like we at Domino's, we have a very big customer lifecycle program, which works on not only just the recency frequency monitoring, which is the regular model being adopted everywhere, but again on the consumer behavior aspect, basis what kind of the behavior he's imposing with respect to the purchases he is doing with me, from the kind of pizzas he's purchasing, the ticket of the pizza he's purchasing, the size of the pizza, the days, and all that makes them as a unique, different consumers in a different tracks. And those tracks and then are being run and churned to using an AI model to ensure that we are reaching out to the right audience in the specific set of those track also. Ensuring the cost of communication is intact, because SMS anyways is very costly in this market. And that's the way we have evolved going forward. In fact, this whole data capturing and utilization in our lifecycle program also helps in acquiring those new customers, because then what we still do is that we use these set of users and find their lookalikes in the outside market, so on Facebook, on Google. So whatever we are targeting outside is also very refined and fresh. So our customer new acquisition targeting cost also goes down. So that's so in totality, the data is the key, and how are you capturing and utilizing is what makes you a better marketer.
All right, thanks, Mayank. Keith, as the CEO of Daily Vanity, which is Singapore's leading beauty e-magazine, how do you advise businesses to use media to increase the visibility and awareness of their e-commerce platforms?
So I think for media, many people will be just looking at usually Facebook, Instagram ads, or influencers. These are like the immediate go-to places that, oh, if I advertise, I'll go to these places. But I think that we are too focused on the new shiny object sometimes. We need to step back and remember the hygiene factors, like are we appearing on Google search on the organic part when people search for recommendations or for reviews? Because I think in the past 5 to 8 years, people have kind of forgotten that a lot of research is still being done and purchased through Google after they know about the product. Because let's recall our own buying process. And we see an ad on Instagram or Facebook, or maybe an influencer shouting out about the product or service. Do we usually buy it immediately? I don't think so, right? Based on our survey, so Daily Vanity actually runs an annual consumer survey to find out more about the consumer's behavior, data that we may not see on the ad performance side, but really towards how people are thinking and how are they using the channels to purchase things. So from there, we realized that 96% of women in Singapore will search for reviews before they make a purchase. So let's say even though if you find an ad on Facebook or Instagram, these people are going to search for reviews. But if they can't find a review, we realize that majority of them won't purchase your product. So that's what we define as the leaky funnel, whereby yes, you're doing all the advertising work, the top of the funnel, everything, you're doing it right, you're acing it, people are knowing your products. But once they research about your product, they may realize, oh, but there's no review about it. No one is saying it's good or bad. Should I buy it then? This is something that we realized through our data collection, something that Mayank also mentioned about data. But instead of just ad performance data, we're looking at data of the mind. What are people thinking about? Yeah, and I think that with all this information, we can really do a good job in really creating a funnel that is so solid that when we run a campaign, we know what our consumers are thinking. We know how to get them to buy things. Of course, buy things that are useful for them, not because we want to sell them things. Yeah, and if you ask me, for the past few years, Daily Vanity has always been using this information to educate our clients, to tell them, these are all the blind spots that they have missed out because we when you think about the ad performance optimization, but how about optimizing our whole marketing mix through this data? Because what started off as just, I want to roughly know what my readers would love to read, that kind of thing. It became a whole full suite of information whereby, oh, there's actually a blind spot here that we didn't know. Like, I think about 3 years ago, blusher suddenly became a top use product that no one realized that it became top use. So with this information, we created content and also let our clients know about, hey, blusher is getting more popular. Maybe you want to push out a blusher product or just different kind of formats, that kind of things. So this allows us to see the blind spot and also to see blind spots of where people are being convinced to buy the things. Basically, they're kind of like their purchasing path. Yeah, and I think the main takeaway that we want to have here today, right, will be to, of course, data is very important. We all know about that. It's like ad performance data. We need to find all this performance, that kind of thing. But we also need to really find out why our consumers are buying our products. It's not just because of price point, right? There is other intrinsic value towards it, like the branding behind it. I think Abdul mentioned earlier on, it's like the feeling, what kind of, when they purchase something, how do you feel about the product? And this information may not be able to derive such information just from ad performance itself. We really need to understand our client, our consumers very, very well to this level. And I think once we get the key idea correct, which is knowing our customers very well, everything will just fall into place.
Thank you so much, Keith. You made a very, very pertinent point about leveraging customer experience to bring in more customers, right? Like displaying customer reviews. In fact, there has been a study which said that customer reviews could actually increase conversions by as much as 380%, in fact, for high-end products. I mean, that's mind-blowing to me. So thank you so much, all the panelists, for your invaluable insights. I mean, I'm sure like me, our audience today would have gained a lot of actionable inputs on taking their e-com strategies to the next level. Thank you, panelists, and thank you all for attending this session.